Welcome to AI Home Podcast, the first podcast for real estate resources and independent living strategies for the disability community. Why? Because accessibility is home. Hi, I'm Angela Fox, blogger, author, and your host. Now, let's begin. Thank you so much, Aditha, for joining us. I know we have talked about a little bit about your background, but for the audience, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about you?
Sure. So my name is Aditha Thummalapalli. I'm 25 years old and I have Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And right now I work as an engineer with my hometown in the city of Salisbury. And a lot of the work that I do revolves around permitting for any new housing development, other type of development that happens within city limits. And as part of that, a lot of what I do deals with building code regulations and DA regulations and regulations put in place by the Rehab Act, Section 504, as well as the Fair Housing. So that's essentially what I'm here to talk about.
That's great. I heard you say the ADA, the Rehab Act, the Fair Housing Act. What are they and when do they generally apply when it comes to accessibility in housing?
Yeah, sure. So the ADA stands for the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this was passed in 1990. And basically it's the big sort of government regulation that we have for accessibility in all aspects of life. As most people with disabilities know, life was very different before the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. And essentially it was a very groundbreaking act when it was passed, and it still is, but essentially it provides the baseline for the bare minimum that people need to achieve, or the bare minimum requirements in order for something to be accessible, whether that be a public space, whether that be new type of technology, whether that be public transportation, whether it be a meeting place, whatever. The ADA provides basically the bare minimum. One thing that many people might not realize is the Americans with Disabilities Act doesn't really apply to private spaces.
Mm-hmm.
It mostly deals with public spaces, almost exclusively with public spaces which can be regulated by the government. Now, the issue with housing is it's private property. So the ADA doesn't really stretch into that realm, which makes it extremely difficult for individuals with disabilities to find homes and find apartments and find places to live that are truly accessible. The Fair Housing Act provides a little bit more guidance as far as what can be done to make private spaces uh, accessible or more disability friendly. Again, it only provides the bare minimum. And as we all know, there's so much more that you can do just beyond the bare minimum. The way I like to think about it is all these laws and regulations, they're basically the floor. They're basically what you need to achieve, what you have to be legally compliant. But there's so much more we can do with homes and apartments and just housing in general to make it more accessible, more friendly for individuals with all sorts of disabilities.
Well, I remember when the ADA, believe it or not, got passed, and my very first time of using public transportation was in Chicago because I grew up in Indiana and I was a teenager. Because when I was a kid, the law didn't exist. I heard you say the Fair Housing Act is available and it's just basic. And if I recall, some of the actual language in the Fair Housing Act is like barrier free. Barrier free is not the best approach in accessibility, but watch explain to the audience why that's significant to emphasizing why that's just really the basic.
Yeah. So that's a good point you bring up. The concept of barrier free. That can be a very vague term because something that might be a quote unquote barrier for one person may not be a barrier for another. In fact, it might actually be a benefit to them. It might be something that they need. For example, for many wheelchair users, having a roll in shower is almost a necessity. But there's many individuals who maybe need a bathtub to sit down in, or they need
Bench or something.
bench, or even like a tactile reference for those with low vision or blindness. They might have difficulty navigating these spaces, and they might need to feel for the edge of a bathtub to make sure that getting in safely. Whereas for a wheelchair user, a bathtub might be a hindrance. So the concept of quote unquote barrier free is it changes for everyone and it's unique to the person. So as a catch-all term, it doesn't quite work. And that the bathtub thing is just one example. And there's many other examples that we can go into, but that's the basic idea behind why that's not the preferred terminology. Yeah.
Now, what does Fair Housing Act apply for all types of housing in all situations?
So typically it applies to rental properties.
Yeah,
Definitely.
the 4 units or more.
Yes. So yes, if a complex has 4 housing units or more, then is it needs to legally abide by the fair housing. However, that doesn't necessarily stretch to single family homes. Let's say I wanted to get a house built. It wouldn't necessarily need to meet Fair Housing Act regulations because it doesn't fall under that category of 4 housing units or more. It's a single housing unit. And that makes it difficult because individuals who are looking for homes that meet their needs, homes that are friendly to their disability, makes it more difficult because people simply don't build homes like that. It's not something that crosses the mind of many people. For example, having a threshold at your front door is just common. It's just something that has been in construction practice for years, for decades, even centuries, just simply because of how houses are put on a concrete slab. Just the very idea of that and having the living space be separated from that concrete slab. That's essentially why a threshold exists. And with modern technology, we no longer need to have thresholds at the front of houses. That single step up makes it really difficult for many wheelchair users to navigate, especially if you use a power chair. Many of our power chairs can't climb that, and it becomes a hazard. And it's just so ingrained in how we construct homes that people don't think twice about it. If a threshold didn't get in your way for our audience members out there who may not have a disability, would you even think about it? It's not something you would consider. For example, if you lived in Florida, would you ever consider taking a winter coat with you anywhere? Probably not. It's just not something that comes up in your day to day life. It's difficult for you to be able to predict.
At least not till either you yourself become disabled or age. I really love the analogy of like your environment that you're surrounded to. It's effective on your perception. That's kind of part of the reason why I always tell people why disability can be a challenge is that the majority of the community members become disabled in the 40s, 50s, and older, meaning they spend half their life. So they passed half their life where they didn't need to think about it. So I really like the winter coat in the Florida analogy. It's just your environment and what you're exposed to and what you need, right? And
Exactly.
I wanted to circle back because such a simple concept and there's so much resistance. When you mentioned that we no longer need that threshold, there's still a myth that we do anywhere because we need it for flooding. It'll look bad without it. Can you go in from your perspective a little bit more detail? Why, with our technology, we no longer need a single step? What is the solution to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of it comes down to just modern technology that we have. For example, doors nowadays, many of them are floodproof. They themselves are resistant to allowing floodwaters to enter your home. Typically, the threshold was put in place so it would be a little bit higher above floodwater. So even if your foundation to your home was completely submerged, then the actual living space above would still be safe. And that's also the reason for a crawl space. Of course, in areas where there's high flooding, many houses are still built up on stilts or up on a platform. So honestly, it just comes down to technology that we have. We have replacements for things like a threshold so that, for example, floodwater doesn't enter the house. Snow, when it's melting, if it's up against your door, many of these doors are waterproof nowadays. Like if you were to get a glass door outside of your standard wooden or metal door, does a very good job of providing that layer of, it's not quite insulation, but that layer of protection against something like floodwater, if we're talking about that specific example.
Great. I thank you so much for providing that clarification. Well, talking designers and developers myself, just from an advocacy perspective, there's always that, oh, we have to do it because it could be flood. And I imagine, and maybe you could correct me wrong, but I imagine probably the reason why we've advanced into doors to be protecting from waters going in. It's also probably from a environmental perspective to keep the heat or cold air within the homes. I imagine that is probably the selling point why you want to have these ceiling doors that doesn't prevent water and air from coming in. I bet that's probably this marketing behind
Yeah.
that.
And your assumption is spot on. The reason we have all this technology in windows and doors is simply for insulation to make sure that when you're heating your spaces, heat isn't escaping to the outside when it's cold. And when you're cooling your spaces, heat from outside isn't getting in. It reduces the stress on your HVAC system. So that's exactly one of the reasons. And if something is airtight, typically it's also watertight.
Yeah, and wouldn't it be great if, in addition to the environmental reason, that they would also state, hey, if you have this as your front door, you don't need a threshold. It's a real shame that is not in addition to the environmental reasoning behind it. It reminds me, I had done a podcast episode with Ron Klein, and he invented the barcode on the credit card and so much more. And one particular thing he did is he created one that was multiple list service for real estate out in Chicago. And he did it primarily because he wanted to provide real estate listing in Braille. Eventually, the former president of the Real Estate Association contacted him and brought that whole kind of system, that concept. And yet today, accessibility features and like Zillow and Redfin and so many other MLS listings really lack in accessibility options for real estate agents to even select. In line to very much of the barrier-free blank statement, a lot of these list services just said ADA or accessibility, and there's no really defending what that is for the real estate agent to even list. And yeah, it's as a result of having Braille, real estate listing in Braille. And that has gotten lost from the early 70s to 2020. And I really wish the disconnect would have happened. That's unfortunate.
It is when we see in past innovations that we feel this could really help us nowadays that just fall out of fashion or people stop using them or use them less and eventually they just disappear from our day lives. And if it's something beneficial, it's sad to see it go.
It does.
But
It's sad to see that the inventions and the needs of the disability community are maybe there or were there, but they're not advertised. They're not announced. And it takes very little to do that. So what other examples can you share with the audience as far as accessibility things or myths of things that when housing developers have in their head that you have to correct and try to, provide them with the resources?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, one of the things that I've started recommending to them is in my own bathroom at home, instead of having a door that swings open and shut, I have a sliding pocket door. So essentially, it slides into the wall, and that eliminates the space that's taken up by a door swinging into your bathroom. And that can be a huge space saver. And it allows for the turning radius of the wheelchair in the bathroom without having to accommodate that extra space for a door swinging in or swinging out. So that's one of the things that I certainly recommend to developers or even those who are interested in buying or having their own home custom built. Like currently, the house that I live in, which is owned by my parents, we had to have our house custom built. It's a custom built rancher, so everything is on one level, and my bathroom has the sliding pocket door. And another thing, instead of having steps up to the front entrance of your house, you can have a gradual slope. So what ends up happening is lots of times you would have a curved sidewalk going from your typically your garage area, that asphalt, to the front of your home that sort of wraps around. And then at the end of it, there would be two or three steps up to your front porch. Instead of that, if you start at a gradual incline where the sidewalk meets the asphalt, you just continue that incline up. Eventually, it becomes a zero entry incline up to the front porch of your home. And that's actually something that the developer who built our house, the contractor who built our house, he saw that we had done that and he's incorporated that into one of his basic floor plans. So, one of the floor plans that he just offers to customers who want a custom home built, he has about four or five, and one of them is a rancher just like ours. And this floor plan didn't exist until we came along and asked for it.
Do you know if he's separating that floor plan for just for accessibility, or is it something that is he offering for consideration?
Yeah, so it's something he's offering for consideration to everyone. And just if an individual with mobility issues, such as elderly people, those with disabilities, anyone who might benefit from a ramp, he mentions that. But it's not specifically, okay, here is our quote unquote accessible
Right.
version of this home. The
Okay.
home happens to be accessible from the get go.
Oh, that's fabulous. I love let me just re-emphasize that I think this is a great win. And I really want to say the fact that I'm hearing that you guys could help create together a floor plan. So it sounds like the developer listened to your needs and was willing to be open, which can be a struggle. I've had quite a few contractors who would raise their hand and said, "Hey, yeah, to provide accessibility," but they only know one or two things and not really to expand. So it's great that you had a housing developer that was really listen to you and you guys created this floor plan and that he was so inspired that he is now using this. For real estate agents who oftentimes may be working with housing developers to create floor plans, or if you are the consumer, me, you're the disabled person, don't just let that success story and that success floor plan just die. Try and ask, hey, could use in the future and give them permission. That housing developer may feel that it's something specialized you pay for it, which is understandable, but I really want to hit home that don't just let it die on your shelf, that floor plan. Whether you ask the housing developer to include it as part of the package with this emphasis that don't just get this out when you see somebody who's disabled, because you can't all see all disabilities. And second of all, we really want to make this universal. And so really try to encourage them to use it. If nothing else, post your floor plan on a Facebook webpage in a disability group because people will still pay for floor plans to be designed for accessibility because they don't even know that there's plenty of examples that your housing developer could really just use and tweak. And it will reduce your architectural cost if they don't have to do things from scratch. Either way, don't let it die. And indeed, I'm so delighted to hear that your housing developer has included. Do you know if there's any other ranch farms nearby that actually use the floor plan?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, 3 houses over, our neighbor has the exact same floor plan as us.
Oh, that's wonderful. That means you can
Yep.
get into it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yep, and they also happen to have the reason they chose the floor plan is they have elderly parents who use a wheelchair. They saw the floor plan and were like, "Hey, someone already did this. Why reinvent the wheel?
Yep.
It works for our needs. We'll
Mhm.
just do the same thing." So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yep, yeah. One of the podcast episodes I've done is not on my YouTube channel, it's on my Apple or my website, but I had talked about was the movement called visibility and visibility for audience. It came out in the 60s and 70s. And it was this idea that you want to focus on your house on who will be coming and visit. So it sounds like that's what kind of might have happened with your neighbor who has elderly parents that in wheelchairs and may be coming to visit them and probably stay for extended amount of time here and there. And a lot of people may not think about, oh, it's something that I don't need. Okay, you might not need it. You might need it later in life, but okay, you don't need it now. But what about the people you know? Who's gonna come and visit you? But that's what it sounds like with your neighbor that when it comes to the elderly parents. So I'm thrilled to hear about that.
yeah, we were very excited when that house was being built to see, hey, other people are choosing this floor plan, and those individuals themselves may not be may not have a disability currently, but it's like you said at the beginning, anyone can become part of the disability community. It's I like to say sometimes that being someone with a disability, it's the one minority you might become part of at any time.
Yep.
Yep.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I don't know about you, but I'm always thrilled if there's a house I can wheel in.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I'm always very excited when I'm like, oh, this is a place that I can get into. Great. We
Yeah.
have other options for when my friend groups want to hang, but he doesn't always have to come over to my house.
Yes, accessibility housing has an impact beyond just where you live. But
Definitely. And if you really think about it, there's economic benefits to it too. Larger number of individuals might look at your house if you decide to put it on the market one day. You have a whole additional set of people who might consider your home.
I really think, and I would love your thoughts on this because you're dealing with housing developers, and I imagine they're more focused on what does the law actually require, or what does that local permit require for me to do. And so
Mhm.
it might be a little bit harder to sell to say, hey, if you do these things that are not technically required, you will get a return of investment. And I know from my experience that the threshold for that to get them to realize that there is a return of investment is this idea that it will look disabled. It
Yeah,
will look institutional, like a hospital, or it will look ugly, or no one else other than the disabled person can use it. I laugh because I'm like, the disability community do not want their own homes to look like they're in a hospital. The idea that to make it accessible is going to be ugly. It's just lack of creativity and really paying attention, which is a lot of the consultations I do with real estate agents and a lot of things I talk about telling a disability community, I know you're not going to make it ugly, but do have a design forward to it. Make sure it is blended in cosmetically to whatever your decor style is. What's your experience with trying to get housing developers to understand there's a return of investment? What are you hearing from them?
yeah, you make some excellent points. Yes, they are very aware of the aesthetic of the home. They want to make sure it doesn't look, like you said, quote unquote, disabled. And not to brag, but our house, the front facade is multicolored brick. No other house in our neighborhood has that multicolored brick facade. Everything else is just siding. And to tell you the truth, compared to the other homes that look quote unquote normal, I think our house is more aesthetically pleasing. Personally, I think the front looks better than most of the other houses around here. So it's not only, and like you said, these accessibility needs can blend into the house structure. It can blend into the aesthetic, the design, the decor. It doesn't need to be something that stands out. And I think that's where the mindset of how we deal with places that are not friendly to the disability community, we take a very reactive approach. So something has already been in place, and now we're forcing it to be accessible. But if you look at it from the design point, if you think about the idea of universal design, where essentially spaces are designed for anyone, regardless of ability, to be able to use, people of any age, people of any ability or disability, all of that. So if you start at the drawing board with thinking about these things, it doesn't look like an add on. It doesn't look like an afterthought. It doesn't look like, oh, this place was inaccessible and we just stuck an ugly looking ramp on the side of it. No, you can, if you start from the design phase, you can incorporate that ramp into the design of the home. You can disguise it even if you want. You can make it a centerpiece if you'd like. There's so many different ways that you can go about it.
All right. I think we've had great conversation. Is there anything else that you would like to share with the audience as far as from your permitting experience with accessibility or any last words?
Yeah, I would just say if anyone in the audience is a developer or a contractor, certainly keep these things in mind. And if anyone out there is working with a developer or a contractor to make a home more accessible or make a home fit your needs, don't be afraid to ask. There's a lot of things that doesn't even cross the mind of a contractor or a developer. And once you mention it, they just say, "Oh, yeah, that we can do that. We can totally do that. That's not a big deal at all." So if you have an idea for making your home or even homes of others more accessible, just tell someone. It can honestly be as simple as that.
An ask is you don't know until you ask, right? That old,
Exactly.
yeah, okay. Thank you, Aditha, so much. HorizontalHouses.com is the hub for all things related to disability home ownership. You will find my blog, this podcast, my book, and how my consulting services can help real estate agents or housing developers market and tap into the largest minority group, the disability community. Please help me continue this exploration of disability home ownership by connecting through my Facebook page. Remember, sharing our collective experiences will allow us each to lower the kitchen sink but raise the bar for disability home ownership. Thank you.